Thank you very much. Graham, you wanted to...
Last time you were here, Foreign Secretary, we discussed the prospect of COP26 and the anomalous position of China being treated as a developing country. Given the hardening of our position on China, do you still think it's reasonable to sort of bend over backwards and allow China to join COP26 as a developing country with very little commitments to reducing carbon?
Well, so I think if you look at what they said most recently on their NDC, actually I think there's starting to be some forward progress, and I think it's important that when we're discussing China, we look at it in a balanced, clear-sighted way. There are opportunities and risks. One of the opportunities is to work with China on climate change. We won't shift the dial unless China shifts the dial. They're the biggest net emitter, but they're also the biggest investor in renewable technologies. And it is, I can assure you, right at the forefront of, along with human rights in Hong Kong and all the other things, it is always at the forefront of things that I'm discussing with my opposite number, Wang Yi. On the question of whether quite how it should be classified, I appreciate the political considerations. There's obviously that they mesh with the technical considerations that define this. But bottom line is, I want China in the room on the UN climate change talks that we host, because I think, first of all, they make a big difference in their own right, but secondly, if we can get their buy-in, it helps, as I said, shift the dial with all of the other emitters and indeed all the other developed countries who we also need to take action. So what we're trying to do is create a virtuous circle, create some momentum around COP26 for next year. Big year for the UK internationally, hosting not just that, but also we've got our G7 presidency. And I think most foreign secretaries would say this, you want to be able to talk, you want to be able to engage with China because you want to be able to get them to make progress. On their NDC, we're starting to see it, we need them to go further.
Do you believe they announced recently, which you just referred to, that they would be zero carbon in 40 years' time in 2060? Do you think that's a credible objective when they've got 121 gigawatts of coal plants in development at the moment, which is more than half the world's capacity? I understand what you're saying. It's better to have people inside the tent rather than outside the tent, to use a crude analogy. But if they have no credibility in their commitment, yet the objective of reducing carbon depends on them, what is the point?
Well, first of all, I think that what you want to do is get as many countries as possible, particularly the biggest players, committed to ambitious targets, and then you want to work with them, cajole them, coax them, support them to hitting them. And of course, they can be held to an account to their target.
But they can't they, for instance, to be held to account? Well, the only commitment from the Paris conference, the only legally binding commitment, was to report what you were doing, not to actually abide by the targets.
Well, I'm not quite so negative as you are, Graham, about it, only because you're seeing China as a massive investor in renewables. They're the biggest, and also I think that their sense of what sustainable economic growth looks like, from just a raw self-interest, their vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. So I mean, look, you're making a perfectly reasonable critique of China's approach, but I would argue that the best thing to do is to try and work with them on their NDC, which we're starting to do, then on the means to achieve it, and to hold them accountable to it. China wants to be taken seriously as a leading member of the international community. Getting them on the hook for things is one way of trying to encourage that in a positive way. If you've got a better alternative, if we should just ignore China, I know then you need to explain how that's going to take us any further forward, because it's not clear to me that there's a better strategy than the one that I'm putting forward to you.
Just a very general point. I mean, I think that's a reasonable point you make. More than 30 years ago, I led a delegation to Wuhan at the instigation of a Conservative government at the time. And the basis of that was to try and increase trade, academic contacts, to draw China into the community, and that trade would lead to more respect for human rights and more freedom as trade-off. That's failed, hasn't it? And what you're saying is we need them in the room, to discuss it. But that has failed on trade as it's failing on carbon. And final point, with respect, the amount of renewables they have is irrelevant. The actual quantum of coal being used is what is going to contribute to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
I don't think the amount of renewables or their investment or commitment to it is irrelevant, precisely because it makes the case stronger for weaning them off coal or other. But hold on, stay with me a second, Greg. So I've been out. I mean, there's issues with coal, not just with China. There's issues with coal in South Korea, in Japan, in Australia. So
India.
Say again?
India.
In India, and there are many countries with many different issues. What we've got to try and do is make them see the win-win, that there are green jobs, that there's sustainable economic growth, that we can build back, particularly out of the COVID crisis, stronger and greener. Again, I don't, it's perfectly fair. I'm the minister. You're here as a scrutineering parliamentarian. But what is the positive alternative you'd replace this strategy with? Is it that we don't talk to them? Is it that we... What is the alternative? And I do think you're underestimating the sensitivity of China for its own interest to proceed, albeit more cautiously and carefully and self-interestedly down this track than we would want, and also their sensitivity to their reputation for being a responsible member of the international community. I wouldn't want to overstate it. We've seen in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, on human rights, that this isn't going to be a silver bullet on a whole range of issues. But I don't think it's entirely irrelevant, which leads me to suggest that we should keep pushing. And again, as I say, one of the things we're trying to do with COP26, if we can encourage the EU with their NDC, if we can get movement across all of the big players, we're in a much better position to go back to China. And likewise, if China moves, we're in a better position then to build that virtuous circle by going back to those other countries. I think that's the smart way to approach it. We've got a good year till COP26, and I haven't heard a better alternative.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. On the last of these quickfire,